Sorry, I'm just fixing my. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. Most electoral cycles of 4-5 years and are far too long to hold politicians accountable, but also are far too long to ensure that a politician who is stagnating in their policy development is actually pushing forward the policies that got them elected in the very first place. On opening government in the interest of two things: first, increased accountability, and second, a greater propensity of developing policy as promised by politicians, we believe that political parties ought to be able to vote out members of their party that are seen to be ineffective. How does this work? We think that this probably works in terms of the party membership at large voting on things like a simple majority or perhaps even a 2/3 majority, whatever legislature in whatever country can decide what's best for them in that case. In those cases, vote out a given politician that they feel is not adequately representing the interests of the party at large or the general public. We also envision that these political parties would be doing so with a view to things like public polling and approval ratings of the punishing them through things like party discipline, for instance, where you can vote somebody out or you can prevent them from having speaking time, etc. And when aggregated en masse, that means that the voices of people within a given party who are willing to call that person out don't have a vehicle through which they can do so, and therefore never voice their concerns. How then do we make politicians far more accountable? A couple mechanisms. Number one, they are far more responsive to public polls and approval ratings, and political parties are going to look at how the public feels about that given individual. That's because they understand that they can hold that person accountable. They see the fluctuations. They see significant dips in those things. Secondly, they feel significantly less threatened by the punishment of party discipline, and they can start thinking for themselves. So for instance, in a parliamentary democracy, that might look like multiple backbenchers forming coalitions within a given party to try to secure the simple majority or the 2/3 majority to vote a leader out or vote like a cabinet minister who's being completely ineffective out. That's when people are more likely to do this, when in status quo, the comparative is that they have no opportunity to do so whatsoever. I'll take the POI/clarification from OO.
Just to check, this is about divorcing political leadership from senators, right? So your model is that all of the senators come together and vote whether or not to kick out another senator, and if it's 2/3, then yes?
Within their political party, or it could be like the general party leadership and membership. Depends on the democracy and the context, but I think it would probably be within the same chamber, let's say. But if not, we're open to that as well. Okay, third mechanism is that you know that you are not sabotaging your party anymore if you act against a member of it. And with the media, you can claim now that you took out that problematic leader and distance yourself from it. The comparative is that you are beholden to that person for a cycle of 4 years, and they can keep fucking shit up, which means then that you have no ability to back out. Why is this massively good thing for accountability? It encourages parties to be much more transparent now, especially seeing that the general public understands that the party has the ability to be more transparent, has the ability to now hold those leaders to account. Secondly, leaders and other figures during their terms focus on constantly proving themselves and being accountable to the general public. And thirdly, in the worst cases where politicians try to seize power undemocratically, they push out lower members of their political party. They do things like trying to take control of the courts or whatever. In those situations, the members within a party that feel really uncomfortable with that can at least voice their concerns and let it be known to the general public that they don't stand behind those things. Second argument then, why this improves policy development significantly. I'll take a POI from CO.
Can you explain what benefits of your case couldn't also accrue from just shortening political terms to 2 or 3 years, such as in the United States House of Representatives or the New Zealand Parliament? What of your benefits are actually exclusive?
I guess they're not. You'd have to prove why that's exclusive on your side, and it's definitely not. We're fine with supporting that as well. But I don't think that's the point of the motion whatsoever, so we're going to push that aside because most governments have to vote on that in like constitutional settings and whatnot. It's a whole hassle. We have fiat deal with it. Second argument, why this massively improves policy development. There are two major areas of concern that we might have with how leaders or general party members are conducting themselves when in office. First, leaders not delivering on campaign promises or stagnating, seeing that they can stay in office and maintain their prestige for a period of 4 or more years. Secondly, leaders handling crises really poorly. So, for example, a politician that does not handle the pandemic well at all and is being ineffective, does not believe in vaccines, or hasn't been effective in rolling them out, can be pushed out of office in those situations. Thirdly, it's party members that veer far too astray from the rest of the party line. I'll give you an example. Rogue Democrats, for instance, like Kirsten Sinema, being the lone standouts trying to prevent things like transitioning over to a world where the filibuster is voted out and does not exist and does not impede policy development for Democrats, for instance. Those are things that can be significantly rectified on our side in a number of ways. First is that politicians absolutely want to avoid stagnation and try to push policy as much as possible moving forward. Secondly, it's the creation of coalitions within parties, understanding now that they can advance agendas that previously might be barred down by political figures and leaders in particular. Now, to be clear and comparative, on our side, obviously you're not going to vote out a leader that's very popular with the public, and you're also not going to vote out a leader that's being prevented from developing policy like by causes outside of the control, like the filibuster. But in cases where they are ineffective and people need to see change, we cannot wait for 4 years for that to happen. It must be immediate. We proudly propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech and call upon the Leader of the Opposition.
Hi, so I prefer my POIs to be verbal because I won't notice if you wave, and I also won't be checking the chat. So yeah, just feel free to unmute and interrupt. Cool. It seems that opening government think that democracy just doesn't work. Because yeah, you're only truly accountable once every 4 years, but the fact is a lot of politicians are motivated by the idea of getting the next 4 years. Re-election is a big part of a lot of politicians' incentives. As a result, we think this takes out most of their case about accountability and good policy development because we think we have enough of a mechanism that keeps people accountable. We think in the only cases, as a quick piece of rebuttal, that where things are inherently bad, for example, committing a crime, being corrupt, sexually harassing or assaulting someone, those are cases that are already illegal. On our side of the house, we are also happy to open investigations to impeach that person, whatever is necessary, in the cases where it clearly breaks the law. If that person has to leave, we would rather either have their pre-established substitute come in, for example, their VP, or if they leave, we would rather have another vote. What we would not do is assume that because you voted for one politician who comes from one party, that party then gets to own your vote for the remainder of that time. So briefly getting into rebuttal before moving into substantive. We already firstly think that things that are inherently bad are not part of this debate. So therefore, the only thing that is truly bad is not upholding your promise to your constituents. However, you already have a big incentive to do that, to get reelected, and those are the people who voted for you. It is unclear why that is not enough of an incentive on their side of the house, and we think they have to do a lot more legwork to prove why that's the case. In fact, we think the only thing that they truly punish aren't things like not being accountable to your campaign promises, but people who don't toe the party line. We think on their side of the house, it is likely going to be party leaders who are able to persuade 2/3 of whoever we're talking about, whichever politicians, in order to vote a certain way or another, because those party leaders are the ones who are able to value certain politicians over the other and try to boost their careers long term. In cases where people are voting out of their own interests, I don't really care about the constituents from some other state and some other city. I'm out for me. I'm going to care a lot more about that than about accurately reflecting the will and the best interests of whoever that person represents. As a result, we also think that this doesn't really count for policy development. If you're a bad COVID leader, you have enough incentives to fix that, and if you don't, then you're going to be voted out. Three main arguments coming from OO. Firstly, that this is principally undemocratic. Why is this the case? Why do we think it is so important that we respect people's will? Because we think your vote is crucial. The consent of the governed is critical because otherwise the government is an armed mob that gets to go around taking your money, threatening you with monopoly on violence, and telling you how to live your life. The only reason that that is legitimate is because we take people's consent at its fullest. Therefore, why do they break this? Because when you vote for a person. You do not vote for a party. You trust that person to represent your interests. As a result, we think people establish significant bonds with whoever they're voting for in a lot of cases, and as a result, they connect emotionally with that person and have trust in their decision-making abilities as opposed to a party. On top of that, there are some instances where people diverge from the party line. That diversion might be the reason that they got that vote. As a result, you should not assume that you can just lump it in with everything else that the party says. But on top of that, even if their party affiliation was part of the reason why you voted for someone, we should never take that as an assumption, because to ever risk violating that principle is basically taking taking a risk that the government governs without the consent of the people. The government governs as a mob and an armed gang, as opposed to a government that we can respect and uphold democratically. We think a party is ultimately there for convenience and for political leaders to group together. It is not inherent to democracy. It is not essential and does not reflect the people's will. As a result, letting the party have that power is not acceptable. Secondly, then, on why you increase the level of control that parties have over their politicians. We think in the status quo, people might disagree. People might disagree with some of what a party says, but might still join it because other things line up and because they want to have access to things like the democratic primaries, for example, which are very useful for them as well. On their side of the house, we think it is much more likely that people will be afraid to speak out against key things that the party upholds because they're worried that they're going to be replaced. We also think that when power is more centralized in terms of party leaders who are able to sway the 2/3 majority, for example, the impacts of corruption are much worse. We think that this is also going to be particularly problematic when we're talking about political progression and having anti-corporate laws. Because even if these people aren't so corrupt that they're pocketing money from corporations, the fact is that individual politicians care more about their immediate term interests. You might have some who are truly corrupt, but a lot of those people are likely going to just be people who care a lot about their communities and want to go out and make their ideas widely heard and widely known. On their side of the house, however, when you put power in the control of a party, that is a lot more incentive to line up with corporations, because you don't need a corporation to necessarily get into power and to spread one message around. What you do need long-term money for is to exist as a party that has long-term goals running, that has 100 different projects that they want to fund, not just for now, but for the next 20, 30 years. As a result, not even if it's corruption, or not even if it's something that's illegal, but simply entrenched corporate interests, your consistent funders, the people who consistently lobby on your behalf. Those are cases where it's going to be much harder to lobby against this corporate interest. On our side of the house, even though the party has some influence over people during their 4 years, we don't think it is anywhere near to the degree that those people have influence on their side of the house. Because on their side of the house, that influence is immediate. If you do what we do not like, we can kick you out right now. On our side of the house, yes, it might hinder your career to some extent, but you still have the rest of your term to, for example, wait until you are a key vote on a swing issue and therefore gain power. You have enough time to build connections with other political leaders on issues that you do have in common, and therefore are able to make sure that the party influence is not as big of a deterrent in your career as it would be on their side of the house. Last, on why we think their side hurts minorities so much. We think the premise of this argument is that minorities are most likely to be swapped out. Why minorities and low-income people are most likely to be swapped out. But before that, I'll take OG.
CG.
Oh, sorry, I'll take CG.
Sure. The biggest problem that parties often have is one in which they cannot enforce members doing what they want, so they end up not being able to govern in the first place. This happens across the world in like most democratic systems where parties just don't get anything done because they can't properly place their members. How do you fix this?
Vote for as opposed to the party. If the party can't commit to its goals, then it's a bad party and it should lose power. Okay, lastly then on minorities, because we think minorities are most likely to be hurt on their side of the house. We think firstly there's an increased chilling effect. When these people are more likely to have fewer connections because they didn't go to the same university, the same top tier universities that other people went to, they're likely to have fewer connections, feel less stable, and therefore less willing to speak out on certain issues. But when they do speak out, we think they're much more likely to be replaced, because we think firstly, on their side of the house, you are more likely to, for example, be able to replace an African-American politician who is campaigning against gentrification in their neighborhood. That could be really bad for corporate interests that are critical in that state, in that city, whatever, right? On their side of the house, the only backlash, the only counter mechanism you have for making sure that parties use that power responsibly is backlash. Why does this exist to a very small and therefore insufficient extent with minorities? Firstly, because as minorities, they're simply a smaller group. They don't get that much backlash, and therefore you get significantly less attention, especially if we're talking about local politicians. But secondly, we think in a lot of cases, for example, African Americans are very unlikely to switch to the other party. As a result, the party can essentially count their vote as banked because it is extremely unlikely that you're going to replace them with a Republican politician. As a result, as long as you're able to replace that anti-gentrification politician with someone who is not actively oppositional to that community, you're still able to kick those people out. On their side of the house, the voices that most need to be heard are silenced by the people at the top.
I thank that speaker for their speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Amazing. I want to talk about two things. First, I want to talk about accountability. Then I want to talk about policy. Before that, I want to engage with the principle that comes out of opening opposition. Three main responses here.
Number one, obviously this principle is imperfect. In many instances, things such as impeachment or the Supreme Court blocking legislation would presumably also remove people's consent as well. Secondly, and this one is most important, there will be massive fucking backlash to you if you are consistently and getting rid of the most diverse members of your party, especially if it is that you are a majority white party and you get rid of one of the few black politicians within that party as well. You also don't want to seem actively undemocratic when it is that someone is trying to keep you accountable. So that is why you are unlikely to cut them out, especially because the re-election mechanism that opening opposition themselves rely on means that you are unlikely to get re-elected if you do so. Furthermore, the fact that you consistently cut out other members mean that other members within your party as well will be incredibly angry because they do not want this to be a massive precedent, because that themselves is also a threat to them as well. So what that means is that the extreme cases that opening opposition talks about, which is that it's when you have different ideological preferences, it's when you are a minority member of the party, just don't seem to be the instances in which people are most likely to turn towards this. What we identify for you is that, especially given the backlash, this is most likely to exist as a last resort. Why? In those instances, it is most likely to exist when it is that either people are being A, complacent or actively lying during their campaigns and thus not fulfilling their campaign promises. Two, dealing with massive scandals, for example, things such as sexual misconduct or corruption scandals. And three, actively not engaging with crises whatsoever. Those are the most likely instances in which those happen, because in those instances, the calculus of the party is our leadership has fucked up genuinely so badly that in those instances, we do need to get rid of them. So that engages with the final premise of the principle that comes out of opening opposition here. Because if that characterization is true, that means that the democratic principles that opening opposition want don't get solved on their side either, because that means that those politicians lied during their campaigns, fooled voters, or actively did things during their term that were not promises to their voters or have actively harmed their voters significantly. And in those instances, voters give imperfect consent. In many of those instances, it is significantly better then, given that it is imperfect consent on both sides, to at least give them significantly better policy, which, note, opening opposition does not engage with whatsoever. Let's talk about accountability now. So the first thing that they say here is that they will kick out members that are being distant. So there's three things that I want to note about this. Number one, this already exists with punishment, but the difference on both sides in this debate is who is able to access punishing other party members. In the status quo, politicians and party leadership especially have a variety of mechanisms to shut out dissidents. They can do things such as fire dissidents. They can do things such as choose which regions these dissidents have to compete in the next election. So, for example, in a lot of parliamentary systems, what oftentimes happens is that people can party leadership whips as well that oftentimes are incredibly powerful in their ability to punish certain party members. The difference then on our side is we equalize the playing field. That when party leadership has significant power to punish the rest of the party members, on our side, those party members equally have the ability to punish them back by voting them out and by ensuring that they're actually fulfilling their promises as well. That's the first big thing to keep in mind. Punishment exists on both sides. It is significantly more equal on our side when it is likely to be a 2/3 majority. The second thing I would note as well is it's also a 2/3 majority, right? So it is unlikely to be the case that there's one individual that is against gentrification within that party and the other 2/3 just so deeply dislike that individual that much. So I think it's incredibly unlikely that that happens. The final thing I would note is that also it seems unlikely that parties are willing to kick out their most ideologically diverse members, because parties oftentimes have been incented to attempt to paint themselves as an umbrella party in order to be able to attract different members of the electorate as well. So it seems incredibly unlikely that just because someone is different for you for policy preferences, you are likely to vote them out, especially because that policy preference would have likely activated an electorate that other members within your party might not necessarily be able to activate as well. What I want to note now about the accountability mechanism is this. The only response to it is that, we can get re-election on opposition side. But this is the comparative. When party leadership fucks up, the rest of the party only have two options. They can either A, justify the awful things that the party leadership has done, or B, actively block attempts in order to ensure accountability of that party leadership. Before that, go ahead, CEO.
If the party doesn't like the party leadership, they can generally replace the leadership under status quo. For example, Theresa May was kicked out of the leadership of the UK Conservative Party because she fucked Brexit. How do you add anything here?
Okay, so the difference is that in most... Okay, so that's perfect. Number one, because we solve the sabotage dilemma. In many instances, people within parties are unwilling to keep someone accountable because you know that it might sabotage you, especially if that leadership is still the face of your party. However, on our side, you know that you can say, hey, we kicked out the leadership, kicked out the problematic part of our party in the next election cycle, so therefore you know that that person's scandals don't necessarily affect you as well. Number two, because we provide incentives to keep each other accountable, because perhaps you can win the leadership. And even if you don't, the mere fact that there is competition within the party as well means that politicians are more willing to keep each other accountable. Finally, as we identify, we equalize the playing field for punishment mechanisms. Now I want to talk about policy. So there are two problems with the ways in which democracies are structurally set up. Number one, there is no competition during your 4 years. So opposition says that you can get you might want to get reelected, but in many instances you just don't get reelected, or this is your second term or something, right? Regardless, you also know that later on, what you do in your first and second year might not necessarily affect how reelection happens in your fourth year. However, the difference on our side then is that leaders can no longer be complacent because there's consistent competition throughout their electoral term. So that's why you can't lie during your campaign and then afterwards not pursue a certain policy, because the vast majority of party members within that party presumably support that policy as well. But the second thing is huge, right? Which is that there are just a lot of politicians that are fucking up crises. And the thing is that when people get elected, people don't understand what's going to happen in the next 4 years. They don't know that a pandemic is presumably going to happen, such as now. But when people fuck up crises now, we are able to make sure that politics is significantly more relevant to the current time frame. I.e., if a politician fucks up a crisis that you didn't know during election time, we are able to replace them and genuinely protect people and save their lives. For all those reasons, proud to stand on opening government.
And that speaker for their speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Here, why is by turning on video and waving? I'll take someone. Three independent reasons why OO goes through. One, this is undemocratic in the worst way. Two, diffuse is preferable to concentrated power in politics. And three, I'm going to flip all the OG cases into immense practical harms. First, on basic democracy. This is really, really bad because it allows parties, or just organizations made up of people who decide that it would be convenient to win elections, to override the democratic will of the people. It's unacceptable when corporations do this. It's equally unacceptable when parties do this. The response we got from OG was that, well, oftentimes it's always imperfect, right? So it's fine if it gets even worse, I guess. But their mechanization was like, sometimes we also impeach leaders. Yeah, we impeach leaders when they do undemocratic behavior, for example, inciting violence a la Trump, and even then we don't necessarily convict them, or when they commit federal crimes, for example, by being corrupt or being a sexual offender. I think, on the other hand, it's important to preserve this principle to the best of our ability. The reason for this is because every single person is living under like a system that is crushing down on us. And I think that's really, really important that we are able to have the opportunity to express our opinions, saying, yes, I consent, or no, I don't consent. And forcing someone to represent you that you don't agree to is unacceptable. I think that that's why we don't do things such as kick out incompetent presidents in order to replace them with technocracies. First of all, because of that principle, but also for bad reasons, i.e., once you lose your control on this large power, it then tends to slide worse and worse, become more dangerous, and there's nothing you can do about it, which is why preserving this is the most important impact. Two, then, on just flipping all the OG.
Is this frozen for anyone?
It's frozen.
Right. First response: don't PI me.
I think you cut out somewhere around 120.
Yeah,
like
the timer
15
stopped
seconds
at
ago.
125. Okay, had I finished the argument about
Finished democracy, from what I heard.
Yeah.
Okay. Jenna, can we try that laptop? Yeah. We have another laptop just in case, and that Wi-Fi might be better.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Does this seem slightly better?
Yeah, this seems clean.
Okay. Once again, please POI me by turning on your video. Yeah. I'll just take 20 extra seconds then, I guess. Second is just a set of immense pragmatic harms. The first is on minorities and political engagement, where we told you that minorities are disproportionately likely to be the victims of this policy and get forced out of the political system. Their response is that backlash happens, which keeps us in check. Problem with this is that this presupposes a progressive voter base, which is definitely untrue in predominantly conservative parties, such as the Republican Party, such as the Tories, which means that you only get this protection in areas where minority biases are less strong, which is bad. But the second thing is just, I think that their own mechs on why this is likely to be well implemented knifes this, because their mech is, if you don't carry through on campaign promises, we will remove you, kick you out, or we want to do things such as make sure that politicians are better, and this is a structural issue. If that's the case, it's really, really easy to retroactively justify to kick out minorities. But the third thing is that even if it's perfectly legitimate, and it really is because this one lady is illegit, is unacceptable, for example, I think that even one instance is something that will catch the eye of minority voters who are extremely excited about this person being in office, irrespective of why they were elected, not because she had good policy platforms, because they resonated with her. And that means that you feel a profound sense of anger, of dissatisfaction, and of disconnect. Oftentimes it's okay for politicians to observe this, absorb this flow, because maybe it's you lose this segment of the voters. But the problem with the OG characterization is that radical and diverse views don't just bring more people in, they also force people out because they think that they're too extreme or unreasonable, which means that you have a slow drift towards the middle in terms of representation. Second main thing then, in addition to you lose political engagement minorities and therefore they become even more politically disenfranchised than they already are, is just, this is a disaster in their whole thing of crisis management. First, if you want to remove an elected politician who is in charge of a lot of policy deals, this is a kerfuffle. It is difficult. You have delays in doing so. And that's probably true because people in office have political connections and allies. And that means that the whole process takes months and it dominates the political arena, which means that you have less time to just be like, let's set aside our differences and decide to get this over with. But the second main thing is just, even if you're able to get a replacement over some time, you also totally defang the replacement and make them useless. The reason for this is to just pull them some random hapless book and yeeted him into the position. He has no experience, he has no connections. The bottom line is that they have to spend a lot of time and effort reestablishing all the habits that the previous politician had already had. And I think that leads to even more delays, which leads to blood on your hands. But finally, on the best case scenario on their side, about how, oh, you forced politicians to carry through on campaign promises. People would really like to follow through on their campaign promises, because if you make the promises, you presumably believe in the idea, but also because, you want to be reelected. The reason why people often can't follow through on their campaign promises is because there are lots of circumstances that are out of your control. You didn't realize that big tech would be so stubborn. You didn't realize that there would be so much opposition from the opposing party, and there's nothing you can do about it. I think, given that this is so difficult to predict, what you incentivize politicians to do instead is lower their campaign promises and do things, just give up a policy and just do identity politics instead. I think it's unacceptable. I think that makes politics so much worse, toxic, close-minded, and unproductive. For those reasons, I think that we also win on pragmatic benefits. Finally, before I do that, whenever.
You don't need a conservative voter, or you don't need a progressive voter base in order to not want to appear racist, i.e. Republicans love the fact that they have token minorities that they can trot out and say, these people like us. Why would you explicitly need a progressive voter base in order to not expel minorities?
Delicious. Also another mechanism that Jenna provides, because Jenna tells you this is really, really bad because it means that minorities are disproportionately more afraid to diverge from the party line because they're under more scrutiny, which means that fine, you get more Candace Owenses, but that's really, really bad because then you justify conservative and racist views because there are a few standouts which are forced into compliance. Finally then, don't let OG wiggle out of their burden. They say, oh, we won't do this very much because there's backlash. Who then do you kick out? Random white dudes who don't fulfill their campaign promises? Who the fuck cares? Who is this person? I think that the concentrated political system is far, far worse than the one in which power is diffused and parties have limited control. The first reason is parties have fucking bad incentives, right? Oftentimes they have a long-term game plan in terms of politics, which is they care much, much more about corporate interests and getting long-term funding and doing such things as trapping the voter base by doing things such as gerrymandering and doing things such as buying out, like locking in African-American voters, because that's more reliable than changing our platform every single time and allows you to establish not just a temporary advantage, but a long-term advantage. That's bad because it means that you drift away from what people actually want, and also because it leads to corruption and undemocratic behavior. But the second main reason this is horrible is because this also is just like, fine, independent of everything else. I think that sometimes there might be rude politicians who cause trouble and refuse to toe the party line and are bad on their side, but there are also great ones. Why should we default to having less party control and rather than having, like, what I'm saying is that there will be bad parties. There will also be bad politicians. We should make parties stronger to control bad politicians because that makes the scale of harm when bad parties get concentrated power far, far, far worse. Why is this? The first is politicians ultimately still have 4-year terms. If they do something horrible, they can be removed. On the other hand, parties, once they establish themselves and have the ability to clamp down on people, force them to stay quiet, force them to stay towards the status quo, it's impossible to move them out. Oftentimes, because party leaders groom their proteges, and I think that's bad because it's irreversible, but also because the scale of harm is significantly worse insofar as parties have more power, more money, more visibility, and can cooperate and coordinate efforts to be anti-democratic or crack down on people much, much more. For those reasons, covered all their bases, kill Doji, very proud to go through.
Speaker for their speech, and now for the member of government.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah.
Cool. I'm gonna set on my timer. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Yes, opening opposition, I do think you need to realize that this motion is going to happen very rarely. Unlike opening government, I'm going to explain why. 3 reasons. Firstly, for the reason opening government describes themselves. Opening opposition describes themselves. Insofar as people consider democracy a bipartisan value, regardless of left wing or right wing, if you're going to just expel people for every single thing or every single deviation from party policy, you're probably going to be seen as quite a tyrannical party that doesn't respect the will of the voters, and therefore probably going to be painted as extreme and lose a lot of moderates. Secondly, doing this very often just sends a message of lacking party cohesion, i.e. that the party is not able to form a stable government, therefore casting doubt on their ability to govern and pass policy, meaning that the voters are going to be scared to give them a mandate in the first place. But thirdly, there's a selfish incentive on the part of politicians to not do this frivolously. Insofar as you do not want the same to happen to yourself, you probably reciprocally want to do that on the other side as well, specifically because as an MP you also have political connections with other individuals which you formed and benefit you. Therefore, you don't just want to expel your friends for nothing. But this means that those harms are going to happen relatively rarely. However, notice the nuance here. Even if this does happen very rarely, in the cases where it does happen, which are situations where a person is actively harmful to the party as a consequence to the voter will as well and to the electoral outcomes of the party and to governance in general, when this overrides the incentives I just mentioned, even though it happens rarely, it's still going to have large impacts. Before I explain which situations those are, let's just deal with the opening opposition line on we don't want parties to be so strict in enforcing party lines. Even if this doesn't happen, although I explained why it won't happen, even if this does happen, although I explained why it won't happen so often, know that this is in tension with the opening opposition principle. Because opening opposition principle tells you people need to have agency over their lives, which is exercised through controlling the state. Insofar as they do not do this directly, this is only true if the person who you elect to parliament is a true delegate of the individual who elected them. This is then only true if this person conforms to the promises that they gave within the policy package that they were voted on, because only then is the consent informed. Therefore, insofar as parties are better able to enforce the party line, this creates more predictability for voters and makes their consent more informed insofar as they only exercise representation through the delegatorial system. Opening opposition disproves the practical argument through their own principle. Moving on to the cases on which we win. Within this motion is incredibly important in offsetting corruption and patronage networks. What are we talking about? We're talking about situations where in particular districts within a country, corrupt politicians capture seats and cannot be removed through electoral means. Talking about things like having access to local, familiar, or tribal ties, note Rajasthan in India, a very good example of this, having access to overwhelming corporate funding or funding from local powerful families and oligarchs. Thirdly, having captured the local electorate through short-term populist measures. Or fourthly, just being in a safe seat where there is no established opposition to vote you out of office. The problem in these situations, particularly in the developing world, but where democracy is not as established, but I think also in the developed world, because things like corporate funding apply there as well, is there is a huge amount of corruption and patronage. There's an incredible amount of harms resulting as a consequence. One, there's just huge economic harms insofar as money is not being reinvested back into the population. But secondly, the way in which patronage networks work is very often through political appointments and cronyism. clientelism. This means there's a huge misallocation of resources. You often appoint people to run local companies like energy companies or communication companies in order to buy off their political loyalty. This also means as a consequence that the people running the local economy are not people who have acumen to run that local economy. But it also means that in order for you to be able to sustain your political loyalty, you consistently need to be rewarding the same political group or same ethnic group, which means that the most vulnerable within that society, those who are the poorest, those with least political influence, very often minorities, do not get infrastructure and do not get investment. This also means, however, that you create a perception, specifically in multi-ethnic societies in the developing world, that there needs to be a conflict, that ethnic groups need to fight with each other for resources, because that's how patronage networks work. You need to be powerful in order for patronage networks to want to cater to you, which I think creates a lot of ground for ethnic conflict, specifically when resources are scarce. Know this happened in South Sudan when oil prices dropped, also Afghanistan, also Iraq. But lastly, we also think that these parties very often campaign on ethnic politicking, i.e. they antagonize one ethnic group against another in order to retain political power. We think there are also just a couple of auxiliary harms here. One, I think there's populist measures, which are very short term, which can increase electoral outcomes in the short term, but just become ineffective in the long term, meaning you have to increase prices of public utilities and taxes, but also just institution control, insofar as you probably don't have equal and equitable access to things like education or to things like healthcare, things like the judicial system, because only the most privileged have access to those. But it also removes the government's ability to conduct welfare because it gets subsumed within these patronage networks, which means that there are huge amounts of harms to people within that area, particularly the least privileged, but the economic inefficiencies also spill out to the entire country. Here's the thing. The party very often wants to remove these people for a couple of reasons. One, because on the level of the nation, like in national elections, they don't want to be seen as a party that is fostering corruption and supporting corruption. Secondly, I think there's district envy. Insofar as these corrupt politicians very often want to funnel national money to their own districts, I think that other politicians have an incentive to be seen as fighting against this and fight against district privilege. But thirdly, you as a politician running in a particular district don't want to be claimed as being in a coalition with a person who is corrupt. The problem is that on their side of the house, there is no institutional mechanism to expel these individuals, which means that we give a specific mechanism with which the party that probably wants to expel them in the first place can remove these people from office and therefore also remove the harms of corruption, of economic inefficiency, and of ethnic conflict that come with these individuals, but that they cannot be removed otherwise. This is the biggest impact in this debate, because opening government does not have a delta, and they concede this. Their delta is we just expelled someone 2 years earlier. We're talking about individuals who cannot be expelled otherwise, and who have huge impacts upon the everyday lives of individuals, largest impact in the round already. Before I move on to a second argument about accountability and a principle, I'm going to take opening opposition.
None of the harms we prove are hung on frequency. The chilling effect and fear restriction flexibility, the single instance disempowering minorities, the use case causing delays and crisis all outweigh corruption, because oftentimes the marginal difference between the party.
Aditya responded to the minorities thing. I've explained why, given that this happens rarely, the other things are probably going to be irrelevant. I also told you why enforcing the party line is good as per your own principle. You just repeated your case. That's a useless POI. Moving on to the accountability. Opening government just says, you get more accountability. No mechanism as to why. I'll tell you why. Because you get more incentive for people to become members of parties and access internal party control mechanisms. Why is this good? First of all, because insofar as more people are now incentivized to be members of parties because they can control the representatives, they have more control over the party platform. Secondly, no party leaders, in order to run for election, they have to win internal party positions first, which means they have an incentive to stop challengers from arising, like Jeremy Corbyn within the Labour Party, which means they have a pre-existing incentive to pander and to cater to wide and diverse groups within the party, which increase accountability. But thirdly, you don't need to be in the majority. You only need to be a minority group which threatens to siphon off enough votes from the majority candidate, note Bernie Sanders from Hillary Clinton, for the next majority candidate to actually support you. Increased party membership is actually what increases accountability. But lastly, on the principle, know that consent within democracy is only true insofar as it's informed and retractable. No other alternative works. Votes of no confidence don't pass because the entire parliament has sit for re-election. Protests mean you have to risk time and your physical health. This is the only alternative where people can, without risking their lives, actually access informed and retractable consent through the political system. For all of these reasons, vote for closing.
Now that speaker for their speech and call upon the member of opposition.
This is going to be slightly annoying, but someone else is debating downstairs who's my flatmate. Can you guys hear that at all? Or can you hear me all right?
It's clear to me. I can't hear anyone in the background.
Okay, that's perfect then. We should be all right then. Okay, easy. All right, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think this debate should be considered in the context of rising voter distrust and a perception from voters that political parties and the central components of political parties do not represent them. We think that this change in being introduced, i.e. the idea that basically the leadership of political parties could kick out local members if they decide they're not representing their views sufficiently well, would be toxic for amplifying voter distrust and lead to bad outcomes. So do a few things in the speech. Firstly, I'm going to respond to closing government, then I'm going to deal with opening government in the opening half, and then I'll get to our extension on voter distrust and why it's bad for that. On closing government, I have 5 responses to the patronage and corruption network. A, to the extent they have such a dominant stranglehold of politics in that area, and given I presume you're not like suspending democracy in those areas, presumably they'll just win the next election. Secondly, to the extent that they have such a dominant stranglehold over those local patronage networks and local politics, they might presumably then just choose to contest it for a new political party that is then not held accountable for the mechanism proposed by government, which means that goes away. Thirdly, it's unclear why the new local member then representing that area and getting consumed into local politics doesn't then get consumed by the same local patronage networks and the same corruptions that drives local representation and local accountability in that area if they want to continue to be a successful member for their area. Fourthly, would argue that we suspect there's actually a very, very tiny number of these electorates, because for you to be able to carry a majority within that caucus to be able to replace that person, that means you need to have an overwhelming majority against the caucus of, say, patronage corrupt members within your party, which means they must by definition be a minority, because they weren't a tiny minority. They would exceed the 1/3 threshold that will allow you to veto this process as set up by opening government. And then fifthly, I'd say that to the extent that, like, you have a majority to get rid of them, that means that those corrupt individuals within those seats don't have the majority to pass a budget. To the extent that there might be corruption, that corruption is unlikely to be pervasive on a national level, is likely to be restricted to a local level because they're unable to back up their practices and in practice and getting pork and that sort of thing, because for the reasons that closing government outlined are unpopular, they do not have a majority, the party themselves doesn't like them, so the corruption is not pervasive. I think closing government on those grounds takes the donut. On opening government, a few things here. Firstly, I'd flag that the problem they set up as a name is to say that the vast majority of elections globally are not 4 or 5 years. The US House of Representatives has elections every 2 years. New Zealand Parliament, the German Parliament have elections every 3 years. We just think short terms introduce many of the accountability procedures that opening government set up as a problem. To the extent that terms need to be even shorter, then we think that that's something that voters would likely support, because voters would like the kinds of accountability mechanisms that opening government say is a problem. To the extent that this is a problem with the leadership, I'd flag here that this is a existing mechanism available under status quo. To the extent that 2/3 of a party caucus decide that they need to replace the leadership in a parliamentary democracy, they do that under status quo. Theresa May was ousted in order to put Boris Johnson in order to manage the process of Brexit. To the extent that you might be an executive system like the United States, well, clearly since opening government has set the threshold so high as 2/3, that's like the equivalent of impeaching the president. The extent that you could manage 2/3 of the Republican caucus to say they need to replace Donald Trump for his handling of the pandemic, highly unlikely. You would already be able to get the votes to impeach him anyway. We have existing mechanisms to deal with. They tried to say this was like a sabotage dilemma or something. I think that was just fancy debating bullshit terms for the fact they didn't have a response to my POI. On lies, we have elections. On corruption, opening opposition correctly flagged that that's illegal and we have existing mechanisms to deal with it. On scandals, A, you're generally pushed down to status quo. Look at Matt Hancock over last week. B, if it's illegal, you can handle with existing mechanisms. And C, to the extent that it is not illegal and it is a moral grey area because you're engaged in adultery or something like that, we would argue that it is something that voters should have a say over. If you've delivered a great school for your local constituency, you fuck someone other than your wife, that is something for voters to decide. On to the extension. As I flagged, I'll take a POI before that from closing.
The refutation to us is...
I got to move on, sorry. Okay, in the context, this debate should be viewed in the context of substantial party heterogeneity and a fear of voters that are setting control. That looks like West Virginia Democrats being terrified that Nancy Pelosi is constantly putting pressure on Joe Manchin to cede to the wishes of the Democratic Party. We also think it should be viewed in the context of a deep distrust of politics in light of a range of, emerging global pressures and trends. It looks like huge demographic shifts in immigration where people distrust the decisions of their major political parties' failure on climate change, COVID lockdowns and policy failure as flagged by the opening half of the debate, and the amplification of hard-right politics online. Why does it worsen distrust? 3 mechanisms. Firstly, would argue that the passage itself is a signal of distrust of the public. I think opening opposition slightly fucked this up here, right? Because it is not the principle itself that matters here, because the principle of democracy and voters having a say within politics is just a social construction of our norms and expectations of how politics should see to our interests and our preferences. The problem isn't the principle. The problem is that that principle is a reflection of our underlying preferences about how politics ought to function, and those preferences are being undermined by the passage of this legislation and constitutional change. Secondly, political parties, we view, will scare voters on the basis of change in this bill. That looks like the GOP going after moderate Dems in elections by threatening those voters that that candidate will merely be replaced by a radical socialist like AOC, and use language like that. Democrats will threaten that moderate GOP governors will be replaced by hard-right loons like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Ted Cruz and people like that. We think some local people will believe that and be scared that local political parties will override their democracy. Thirdly, we think it weakens the perceived independence of your representatives, because now you believe that your party leadership can threaten your local MP or representative to stop voting them in a way that they ought to, in your opinion. So we think that leads to worse voter and political distrust. We think it worsens turnout. Fewer people get involved in politics. Secondly, we'd argue that it cuts engagement with healthy and honest coverage of politics in the mainstream media. Thirdly, we'd argue that it increases engagement with fringe media and fringe politics. It looks like, people getting more involved in hard-right media and hard-left media, but we also think it looks like fringe political parties pitching that because those mainstream political parties can be held hostage by the treasonous moderate leadership, you actually need to vote in more fringe political parties that might represent your views. And that looks like regional heterogeneity, right? Because if your region is more right-wing or more left-wing than the leadership of your party, you might now need to vote in a more right-wing or more left-wing party instead of simply being a faction of the centrist party. That looks like Bavarian voters voting for the AfD or socialists voting for socialist leaders in New York. We think that's damaging. Politics becomes more extreme. That's a bad thing.
Thank that speaker for the speech and call upon Government Whip to close the case for Gov.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
The top of closing opposition posits exactly why political parties are never going to do this except in ridiculously extreme situations. They're not going to do it wantonly because they don't want to amplify voter distrust. And I think closing opposition knows that because they never actually make arguments about why this is a bad thing. They just make arguments about, the signal of it is really bad. But here's the bottom line, guys. If you can tell a random conservative person in West Virginia that Joe Manchin is going to be replaced by conservatives, you can equally tell him that Joe Manchin is going to ally himself with a socialist like Bernie Sanders and AOC, because if people are scared of Democrats, they're going to be scared literally regardless. That is why they're a politician, or that is how you run against moderates in the first place. The closing opposition extension literally makes no sense because it is at best very, very marginal increases in the ability of people to signal. And at worst, it actually is really, really good in that I think it is probably much better if more political parties spur up, because that breaks like two-party holds on the like writ large political system. Like imagine how much better it would be in the United States if you had like a viable Green Party or a viable Libertarian Party, or in UK, like imagine how much better it would be if you had like more competitive alternatives to like Labour and Tory. In and of itself, I just do not think the CO extension makes any sense. Here is the problem with CO though. There is maybe responses to our patronism extension. There is literally no response to the framing that Tin gives, which I think just damns both opening government, opening opposition, and to an extent closing opposition. Because the importance of Tin's framing was ridiculously simple. He says, you're not going to do this a lot. You're not going to do this on issues where people split politically. Why? 3 reasons. 1, because parties still want to seem bipartisan and not tyrannical. They know that if they do this, they lose the trust that voters place in them, which seems to be the top of CO's case. 2, they know that voters are going to not want to vote for that party because they think if they vote for that party, they're just literally going to be replaced by other people. So they say, there's no point in voting for that party, I'll vote for another party. Therefore, fulfilling the mechanism why the party would never do this in the first place. 3, party politicians don't want this to happen. I want to talk very specifically about politics because I think this beats opening government and opening opposition. Specifically on politics, 1, people are not likely to want to penalize politicians for breaking campaign promises. Why? Because literally party leadership breaks campaign promises all the time. If you're Chuck Schumer or you're Nancy Pelosi, you have to compromise to govern. You compromise all the time on things like healthcare or infrastructure, and you know you can't fulfill 100% of your campaign promises, so you're never going to penalize people for violating their campaign promises because you understand that's just how governance is done. Two, I want to point out here that like 10 senators in the Democratic caucus oppose like removing the filibuster because they are too conservative. And like another 10 senators in the Democratic caucus oppose like anything that's not like the Green New Deal. So what you have is like 20% of the Democratic caucus is to the right of the moderate and 20% is more to the left. Those guys all group up together because exclusive cases in which you are likely to pursue this. It is cases in which the party has vested interest in making sure that it is not nationally tinged with a stain of patronage, where individual members themselves do not like the fact that politicians are allocating special favors to individuals or special favors to districts because they see that as hurting their own constituents, and where they don't want to be claimed in elections for being part of coalitions with those other corrupt members. Those instances are the exclusive case that you actually do get an actual change. That is to say, people being expelled. The response from opposition was just mitigatory. It was like, but corruption is obviously illegal. Like, yes, but obviously, like things like patronage are not. That is to say, it is very, very easy. And in most cases, patronage is just not legal. It's totally acceptable for you to do these things, but it's extraordinarily problematic. It appears corrupt, even if you can't legally remove them. And that's the biggest problem. I want to point out here that, like, 20% of the Indian parliament, roughly, probably has been inserted in some corruption trial. The number of MPs who've been actually arrested for it is like literally zero. I do not think they have credible enough mechanisms to actually remove people in these cases. What are the responses that we got from closing opposition? They said, one, the guy's going to win the next election. Fine, we'll replace them again. They said, two, he's going to create a new party. That's fantastic. Because, see, the problem is right now, they have influence in your party. They're winning a safe seat, and they have the power to make decisions because they're party leadership or they're high up in that party. So they can choose whether or not someone gets appointed to the energy grid, or they can choose whether or not they're able to funnel more money to their like random district. But if like you have to create a new party, that party has no resources. It's never able to control federal allocation of funds for anything. So it is actively better to have smaller parties where the guy's corrupt and you're like, fine, they win one seat in parliament and they operate nothing with respect to the rest of the like BJP, the rest of the INC. The third thing that CEO said was that new people are subsumed into this party politicking. This makes no sense because you don't want to get kicked out, and you know if you do patronage, you're going to get replaced. The last thing he said is these are very small numbers of electorate. Fine, but the consequences are massive. Like the fact that they did not respond to a single one of the impacts that Tin gave is damning, because it is exactly why even one person that is corrupt and needs to be removed is so important. I want to characterize this. The U.S. House of Representatives actually has this mechanism. If you get 2/3 of the member, you can agree to expel someone. It has been used 5 times in history. 3 were for Confederate rebellions, 2 were for bribery. Those are the exact instances where we think this is so important. Opening opposition.
Patronage networks are worse than political parties, where officials exchange favors with one another to form coalitions. This is a uniquely ineffective policy, which at best scapegoats low-level politicians for structural problems.
I do not think it hurts low-level politicians, because the kinds of politicians that we care about, the ones that are high up in the party, those are where all the impacts happen. And that's obviously where patronage happens, like people who are able to control safe seats, who are able to allocate party funds, because that's how patronage happens. You need to be powerful enough in the party, because that's how you allocate funds back to your home district in order to get elected. How does this interact with the rest of the debate? On opening opposition, I think the vast majority of their impact just are out of the debate. On their principle, I think the thing that Tin says is important, because the important point is that consent needs to be informed and retractable. When people are making decisions that you don't know about 2 to 3 years, and you have no way to retract consent about whether or not you voted for that person, your vote doesn't matter. I also think we're fine subsuming this in the impact of how like terrible this probably is towards ethnic groups or minorities in like the cases where you have patronage network. Then on minorities, they say, well, the problem is that Black Republicans are going to be really scared of not towing the party line. They're already terrified of not towing the party line, because if you're a Black Republican in South Carolina, you already know your voter base is racist. You're already afraid you're going to be voted out. They give you literally nothing to think that this is marginal, that not marginal at best. The last thing on political consolidation, I think we proved that you get more political parties, and it seems to be good. Closing opposition, I think we already beat this. I think the extension itself does not make sense. It fundamentally does not change, because labels are sticky. If you're afraid of socialists, you're going to be afraid of them regardless. At best, they give you very marginal messaging because look, the average conservative white voter in West Virginia just does not know about this thing, does not care about this thing. And as long as we prove to you that it doesn't happen that often, which it doesn't, the average voter doesn't see this, which is why none of the impacts from opening government either about political development actually matter. You're not penalizing people for breaking orthodoxy. You're penalizing them in very extreme instances. And while OG points this out, they give you literally no impact to think why this is important. And more importantly, why voters can't vote them out. We do. Very proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech and call upon the opposition whip to close the debate.
Awesome. Can everyone see and hear me?
Yeah.
Amazing. We have another team in the garage downstairs, so they're hopefully finishing up shortly. There shouldn't be too much sound overlap, but if you can hear me already, that's good. Alrighty, starting in 3, 2, 1. By the end of the government bench, we have a single use case for this policy, which is this eradicating patriot networks. To the extent that we can show that that is ineffectual, which we can do, the government bench will collapse and we will get through. Specifically, CO will get through. In this case, in the speech, I'm going to look at closing government's case, at closing opposition, and finally at opening government. Looking therefore at closing government to start. I think it's very clear by the end of this part of the government bench, as I highlight in introduction, they have a single use case here where they say they'll use it to eradicate patronage. Now they say, oh, but you're not responding to our impacts. Your impacts do not accrue in this debate. There's a number of reasons for this. On these patriot networks, insofar as we're talking about things which are literally illegal, the response that still stands here is those are already crimes in the status quo. The kinds of entrenched corruption they were talking about, like literally taking bribes in the Indian political system, would be captured by police already, and political parties could simply cooperate. Unclear why closing government's mechanism here is so vital or important to solving this issue. But secondly, insofar as closing government spends a lot of time characterizing that there are areas and seats where there are tribal interests that are deeply entrenched, or there are corporate interests that are deeply entrenched, those would obviously immediately recapture any person you replaced in this seat if you accept that analysis from closing government, which is to say those corporate interests would immediately seek to cooperate with that new person, and that new person would essentially resume the exact same corrupt function that that previous person had. But crucially, insofar as they're talking about tribal or ethnic tensions as closing government characterized, if you have had someone in a seat for a number of years, as CG suggests, and they have been hyping up ethnic tension in that region, it is very, very difficult for a neutral politician to come in who does not respond to voters who have had those ethnic tensions inflamed. They're going to be forced into entering into that tribal politics and entering into that same extreme card that just demos CG's case here, is they just won't participate in your party. They'll run as an independent, funded by that corporate money or that tribal money, and elected by those tribal and corporate interests, and have that seat as an independent anyway, as they can under status quo. Your mechanism will not accrue. But another reason that CG's benefits just simply do not accrue here is they cannot decide what they are talking about, because CG tells us this won't be used very often, so your benefits on CEO can't accrue. But at the same time, the benefit CG wants to claim in this debate is that they could remove 20% of the membership of India's ruling party, or remove the leadership of India's ruling party. Firstly, those are a huge number of cases if CG wants to get the scale of the benefits they're talking about, but they are also deeply visible. That is unlikely to happen, firstly because it would lead to all the harms we talk about. There's no incentive to do it. But secondly, no political party with any degree of sanity is going to publicly admit that they think 20% of their elected members participate in corruption and oust them. They're going to want to cover them up for the same incentive that opening government stated, which is that you have an incentive to quiet and hush down misconduct in your party. Parties will not use this mechanism to visibly punish large numbers of their leadership in the way that closing government needed them to do to get their benefits. Closing government benefits cannot occur in this way, and therefore they fall out. Before I talk about our case, I'll hear from OG.
The 3 CG pieces of framing are literally copied and pasted from the first minute of my speech, but what we added was the willingness to call out scandals and equalizing the ability of party members to hold each other accountable, which was not responded to.
That's your beef with CG, and frankly, none of my business. You should both fall out of this debate. On your accountability stuff, I'll deal with it later. That is in the hands of voters. I'm now going to talk about my extension, and what I just want to flag in response to our extension is that actually voters are far more willing to engage and trust democracy when they feel they are in charge of policing that accountability and policing those scandals. That's the unique benefit we provide you at CO. Empowering voters makes them willing to trust and participate in that democratic situation. Right, weighing that CO case, we change how people feel about democracy. All the other teams in this debate wanted to talk directly about impacts they thought they could get with regards to principles like OO does, or with regards to accountability like OG does and CG do, without explaining why those things matter to people and why they impact democracy more broadly. It's worth noting the context that my member sets up unresponded to by CG, which is to say that we're at a time of distrust and polarization where people have a lot of fear about what other political parties are doing. If you look at the fear of Tories in the United Kingdom, that Corbyn was a socialist and socialists remain in that party. A huge degree of polarization and distrust worsened on the government bench to extreme impacts I'll tell you about in a second. Now, the mechanisms here that drive this distrust that I don't think CG quite grasps, the passage itself of this process, which is to say it being put into law, people hearing about it, is basically a warning bell for voters that they cannot rely on the government to listen to their needs uniquely, and they cannot expect the government to act by that principle with which they expect they ought to. But crucially, they also think that political parties are going to be like enacting representatives they didn't want, which is deeply scary. What we hear from CG here is that, oh, well, there's incentive to just scare your opposition voters regardless. You'll still say Manchin might be a socialist. But on Gov, this is clearly much worse because now the Democratic Party actually does have a mechanism by which they could oust Manchin. Now that is literally a possibility. Clearly the scaremongering can be backed up by fact. But crucially, it's not just about, oh, well, the Republicans will scaremongery, so you'll vote for the Dems. You won't trust any party because all political parties have an incentive to reference this policy to make you distrust the other candidate, with the effect that we think turnout is driven down across the board because of distrust from voters. And you weaken the independence of those candidates in heterogeneous and swing seats with unique needs because they are subject to this harsh whipping by the party. The impact here is you reduce trust and turnout. Uniquely here, the accountability and the principles don't matter. It's about whether people feel a high quality of life because they have faith they're living in a democracy which serves them. We uniquely explain why when you erode that trust, you lower people's quality of life, irrespective of policy outcomes, because they feel they're in control of their own governments. The fracture you get here with parties propping up is not just about minority parties like the Greens representing minority views, but parties cropping up which literally prey upon distrust. So they're not minority views parties, they are aggressive partisan parties like the AfD in Germany who prey on ethnic distrust and particularly people who have bought out of politics to deeply nefarious populist ends. That is the impact we bring you at CO. Very finally, some weighing with regards to OG. I think that they only get issues happening at any effect in a very small number of situations, like voter promises, like scandals and incompetence, where voters ought to be making the decision and practicing that accountability. But our case shows you why voters won't trust in democracy as a tool for them to be able to do that. So our case explains to you why those issues OG cares about, voters are less able to have control over on our side of the house to significant harm. Very proud to oppose.
Thank that speaker for their speech. Thanks everyone for that debate. I believe we stay here to judge, right?
I think so.